This is our next topic, sustainable economic development, our second last topic in third year business. So just to kind of get into it straight away, economic growth is kind of what we're focusing on for the beginning part of sustainable development. So what is economic growth? It occurs where there is an increase in the quantity of goods and services produced in an economy from one year to the next. So obviously, look, you hear this economic growth that's thrown out there in the news. It's something that you would come across. Uh, but like, how does somebody quantify economic growth? In other words, how do you know that the economy is growing? And you can't just take a guess. So what we do is we check the amount of goods and services that are produced in an economy in one year, and we compare it to the next year. And if it goes up, there's economic growth. If it goes down, then obviously there's no economic growth, there's degrowth. So what we have, let's say, with the pandemic would have obviously been a decrease in economic growth. So, in general, on a year-to-year basis, over the last 100, 200 years, there has been a slow increase in economic growth, and in the last 30, 40 years, there's been a massive increase. Positive effects of economic growth, there's a large list of them here. Increase in employment. Obviously, if there's more things being produced, there's generally more people employed and less social payments and social protection payments as well in some cases. Improving in standard of living. Why? Because look, if you think of it simply, if there's a class of 20 people, if 20 of those people are employed, they have more money, they generally have a better standing of living for themselves, versus if half of the class is unemployed, now you could have some issues with potentially living standards dropping because you don't have as much income. Government will have more revenue because people are paying more income tax and the government don't have to pay as much social protection. Think of it in the last year with all the pandemic unemployment payment that the government had to give, how much of a debt crisis the globe is kind of incurring because of COVID. Better public services, because the government has more money, they can spend more money on increasing public services, whether it's road or anything to do with transport or public buildings. Goods and services, there's more of them available, and a decrease in national debt. All of these kind of lead into one another. So these are other positives from economic growth increasing. New business startups, basically there's more business, there's less emigration, because basically there's less people leaving the country. I suppose in case of looking for a job, more immigration would be more people coming in, and generally obviously more jobs available for those people and more spending. Increased employment will lead to increased demand for goods and services, because you've more money, you'll buy more goods and services. Generally it's kind of a case of when economic growth goes up, everybody has a little bit more money. There's an increased demand for higher education because more people have money to spend on things like college tuition fees. Countries with high economic growth spend more money on infrastructure, which is generally public buildings and roads, and increased living standards have a positive effect on life expectancy. In other words, you live longer. There is a lot of stuff to take in there, a lot, and I've just kind of listed them up because I wanted to go through and explain everything. The parts that are in bold are kind of the main parts I want to focus on. But you know yourself that because we now know that economic growth is an increase in the quantity of goods and services produced in an economy from one year, so that if nobody was producing anything in Ireland for goods or services, our country would obviously be suffering majorly. There'd be very few people having any form of income, there'd be absolutely no spending, and everybody would be broke. The more we produce, the more goods and services that are available, the more the people are generally buying, the more jobs that are available, the more money that's there, the more money the government can spend on public infrastructure. Obviously, there's less debt, there's a better standard of living, again, there's more business startups. If everybody has a job, generally things go well in terms of people have money to live a better standard of life, and it increases people's life expectancy. These are just domino effects of each other. There's a lot of them listed there, but if you take a general understanding as what would happen if everybody had a little bit more money, you could kind of think through these two slides. The next element of this, and then obviously the chapter itself, is looking at sustainable development, and most of this comes from I suppose looking at the negative side. So there's quite a few things here. The first slide I kind of have an issue with because it's negative effects of economic growth. And what we're doing here is we're looking at the population, because the population in the 1700s was about 1 billion. As you get up to the 1800s, you're closing in on 1.5 billion to 2 billion here. This is around the time of World War I. There's about 2 billion people in the world. By the time we get to World War II, there's just about 3 billion people in the world. And suddenly you fast forward 50 years on from that to the late 90s, and there's 6 billion. You pass on then from the late 90s to the 2020s, and you're looking at there's 7.8 billion people in the world. So the projections are that it'll hit 9 billion over the next 20-30 years. And obviously there are issues that come with that, because as there's a higher population, there is economic resources are more scarce. Food production can become a bigger problem, and trying to keep up demand for the growing population, because the population is increasing and generally there's more trouble getting food and some scarce resources, I suppose. Kind of problem I have with it is it's not all negative. The reason this is happening a lot of the cases is because we have a better standard of living and people are living longer. So what's the alternative? Hope that people live less. In other words, people die earlier. That doesn't sound too great either. So there's a double-edged sword there, but I wouldn't say it's a huge all negative, because it's important that people live long and prosperous lives, but there is an effect on resources being available as well. So as I said, double-edged sword. Other negative, I suppose, effects of economic growth: with the increased standard of living and full-time employment, there's less time at home. People can spend more money on these fast food style convenience food, which has caused people obviously to require to generally eating more and moving less, which has led to a lot of cardiovascular and health issues, and obviously obesity from people consuming in excess. I suppose it can be linked in a sense that generally as somebody improves their standard of living, you start to see more and more issues like that. The countries as well with the lowest standard of living, I think Vietnam is the country with the lowest obesity rates in the world, and obviously the Vietnamese people, there was communism is still in operation there. Well, generally there's not a whole lot of wealth in areas or around that, whereas the typical kind of, I suppose, the US and some other prosperous nations around the world would have the higher obesity levels in the world and generally would have a better standard of living. But again, it can't all be to blame on the economy. Looking at more kind of elements here, I suppose the economy can be over-reliant in a particular industry. It happened quite globally, but here in Ireland we called it the Celtic Tiger, where everybody was relying on construction and the massive increase in property prices, and everybody wanted to own a house, and then investors, everybody wanted to own a second house if they could afford to do so, and there was a massive property crash, over-reliant on that industry. Now there's more here that I would say are more important things to focus on rather than some of the stuff we've looked at here. I would say economic growth has led to deforestation issues. So economic growth can lead to destruction of natural habitats to build factories, because people are so focused, I suppose, on money, that if they feel like cutting down half the Amazon rainforest will make their company a couple of $100 million, they're willing to do that. And obviously that has led to huge issues and more issues to come down the line with climate change and issues for those species that were living there and things like that. So deforestation would be one key negative effect. Increased pollution, again, this is falling on the lines of climate change. For example, air pollution caused by fossil fuels required by planes and cargo ships that are used to export goods around the world. And obviously there's many more things that are contributing to the pollution crisis, but definitely our over reliance on that industry and our constant increase in production has led to an increase in pollution. A couple of more that we're going to look at, because I'm not going to do a whole lot today, just kind of introducing the chapter. Increased traffic congestion can lead to generally more goods in turn. Again, we're focusing here on exhaust emissions. Again, a lot of this is focused, I would say, on the climate change, because the chapter itself is sustainable economic development. So we're looking at sustainability, which is more or less looking at kind of our world and trying to build a more sustainable world. So obviously these emissions from the vehicles that are constantly traveling has added to increased pollution and greenhouse gases. More landfill sites required for a large amount of consumer waste with the amount of things that we are uh, you know producing. And I seen something recently which was actually quite shocking, that 10% of the I think 10% of the emissions or something to do with the waste was to do with the fast fashion industry that has started to develop more and more over the last 10 years. Um, that, nowadays somebody might buy a cheap pair of, Converse kind of lookalikes from Pennies, and you buy these, like, let's say white shoes. They look like Converse. They're from Pennies. They kind of fall apart after 3 or 4 uses and they're no longer white. So you wear them going out, 2 or 3 times, and then you throw them away and you get a new pair. They're not, they're from Pennies, so they're cheaper. So instead of you buying one pair of shoes, you go to Pennies and you buy 6 pairs of, plain white shoes. And over the course of the year, you wear those 6 pairs, and you wear them a couple of times each, and you throw them away because their quality isn't as good. And that's our fast fashion industry, that people are buying things like that, wearing them a couple of times, and then essentially throwing them away. And it's led to a massive increase in landfill sites and general, I suppose, emissions and pollution. And fast fashion is starting to become one of the major crisis areas for basically our contribution to global warming. And that's something that we hadn't seen as much of over, before, let's say, the last 10 years. It was still there, but people are doing more and more of it now. So I suppose, seeing as we're looking at sustainable development, is kind of an extra encouragement for you not to engage in that practice of buying clothes for only wearing a couple of times and then throwing them away. I'm going to focus on 1, 2, 3 more. Okay, so last 3 that we're going to look at. Since the Industrial Revolution in the late 18th century, business activities contributed to climate change, to increase in fossil fuels, carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, and greenhouse gases causing the temperature to rise, which is more or less a summary of what I've talked about there. Basically, it's our effect on our climate and the increase in greenhouse gases. We've seen our increase in business activity, increase in use of fossil fuels, and pollution itself has all led to the crisis we are undergoing, one of many factors. Economic growth can cause income inequality. The gap between the rich and the poor has increased greatly in recent decades. Generally, you'll see more and more of that as businesses at the top, even businesses like Amazon, that would be growing more and more due to people. The accessibility of buying things from around the globe at the click of a button, and how easy it is that these larger multinationals companies are growing larger and larger. And the wealthier become wealthier, and then obviously maybe there are certain jobs that are being taken away from smaller areas, so you have people in those areas out of work, and obviously that's where income equality comes into effect. I'll be kind of touching on this stuff again down the line, but I'm kind of just introducing everything for now. The last one I'm looking at is the destruction of landmarks and historical importance. I wouldn't focus on that again. This is Edco slides. I like the slides for I feel that they're the most informative and in line with the junior cert, but I don't think it's necessarily a strong point. I would say our biggest focus for negative effects of economic growth is on our pollution. The increase in fossil fuels, our increase in deforestation, our emissions from cars, and our pollution from landfill sites. Those, I think, are the bigger areas. I don't think you can blame the economy on things wearing down as much, and I don't think you can blame the economy as much on people living longer and that being all bad. You have to have some understanding there as well, and obviously obesity has high correlation between high economic growth, but again, it's not like you'd wish people to have a poor standard of living. We'll be touching these things again down the line, but that's kind of our introduction to what economic growth is. And if there's one thing I do really want you to focus on here, and when I'm doing this too, I'm just trying to, I suppose, focus on your understanding of the topic rather than just focusing on the theory. But your understanding of economic growth is important. So it's an increase in the quantity of goods and services produced in an economy from one year to the next. And we measure this with GDP, which is our gross domestic product, or GNP, which is gross national product, and we'll be looking at that again in our revision. But that's our kind of our main focus and intro into this topic. Thanks for listening.